Main groups of American settlers who came to Texas: Appalachian hill and mountain people who settled in northern Texas to build small, self-sufficient communities within which they wanted to be as far away from New England and the South, as well as their governments, laws and regulations, as possible; and Southerners who settled along the Texas coastline who wanted to expand their slave plantations for profit and create a new slave state to expand their political power in their rivalry with New England. However, the majority of settlers were Southerners. These groups encountered and became neighbors of the Nortenos. But rather than deeper tying the Nortenos into Mexico, the Americans and Nortenos found increasingly more common ground. They both couldn't stand the authoritarianism and attempts by Mexico City to control their lives. Nortenos increasingly wished to liberate themselves from Mexico City's tyranny. The Southerners were by and large failed slave plantation owners running away from creditors and debt collectors from Louisiana to South Carolina. They didn't bother learning Spanish, certainly didn't convert to Catholicism, and imported slaves in violation of Mexico City's abolition of slavery. People like Hayden Edwards, who, when he was reminded of Mexico's ban on slavery, declared himself independent in the Republic of Fredonia, where he legalized slavery. The Mexican army deported him back to Louisiana. However, the tide could not be stopped, and so, in 1830, Mexico banned immigration. But Americans kept coming, and Nortenos supported them, as it brought the markets with which they were trading closer to them. Americans started outnumbering Nortenos by 10-1, but both groups were not in conflict, but unified in opposition and open defiance against Mexico City. The Mexican perspective here, especially of the Tejanos, is often overlooked. The conflict between the North and South kept boiling, and all it would take for it to blow up was a spark, which came in 1833. When Santa Anna became president of Mexico again in 1833, he wanted to ensure that he would not be removed from power again. So he suspended the Mexican constitution, sent all his opponents into exile abroad, and seized complete power of all Mexican government institutions. Almost instantly, this led to rebellions all across Mexico, in Coahuila, Texas, New Mexico, and Alta California. California went so far as to declare independence, threatening to remain such until the Mexican Constitution had been restored. Pueblo Indians in New Mexico rose up in revolt, took Santa Fe, killed the governor, and declared a mestizo buffalo hunter to be their new governor. Santa Anna spent the first 2 years of this new presidency marching through northern Mexico with an army, crushing one rebellion after another with increasing brutality. Tejanos, angered by the move into absolute dictatorship, the previous decades of neglect and authoritarianism, and by Santa Anna's increasing brutality, had enough. They demanded at first for Tejas to become a separate state from Coahuila, but to still remain part of Mexico. But support for that increasingly dissipated, and leading Nortenos such as Juan Seguin, a friend of Stephen Austin, and Lorenzo de Zavala joined forces with separatist American settlers to demand complete independence from Mexico. At the Battle of the Alamo, 12 Tejanos were amongst the 200 fighting for an independent Texas. Lorenzo de Zavala would become the first vice president of Texas. Juan Seguin would lead Tejano rebels at the Battle of San Jacinto, the deciding battle that secured Texan independence and administered the burial of the dead after it. But it was already during the war where myth started to be created. Southern newspapers reported on this war as a conflict between white Anglo-Americans in a war against an inferior, mixed Hispanic race and their tyranny. Stephen Austin called the war
a war of barbarism and despotic principles waged by the mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race against civilization and the Anglo-American race.
All of it lies through and through. Tejanos had risen up side by side with American settlers as Texans, primarily against Santa Anna's dictatorship. And when the revolution was over, the Nortenos who had rebelled against Mexico City were betrayed. Southerners flooded into Texas to build new slave plantations along the coast, and the Nortenos who had lived there were dispossessed and driven off the lands. Juan Seguin, who was elected the mayor of San Antonio in an independent Texas, was sent into exile after a rabble of southern newcomers accused him of being a Mexican spy. He returned years later after being proven innocent to discover in anger how Texas had been turned into a racially segregated society, with the Nortenos restricted to the lands along the Rio Grande, and where none of them could hope to achieve any political representation or power within this new state.
At every hour of the day and night, my countrymen ran to me for protection against the assaults or exaction of those adventurers. Sometimes, by persuasion, I prevailed on them to desist. Sometimes, also, force had to be resorted to. How could I have done otherwise? Could I leave them defenseless, exposed to the assaults by foreigners who were on the pretext that they were Mexicans, treated them worse than brutes?
A powerful myth was born from these events, which became accepted historical fact for almost a century. A tale of brave southern pioneers who settled the land and freed it from Latin despotism. A tale that removed the story of the Norteno completely. And perplexingly, as we changed the way we tell history in the mid-20th century, a new counter-myth that called itself progressive was born, but was just as mythical. A tale of devious southern slave owners who stole the lands of Mexicans. A half-truth, but still therefore only half-true and half a lie. A tale that casts the Nortenos as victims but doesn't acknowledge their participation in the rebellion and their dreams and hopes for freedom, and therefore falsely frames and omits the story of how those hopes and dreams were betrayed and crushed. The Nortenos remained in the United States from Texas to California. Juan Seguin, upon returning to Texas, would become one of the first community organizers and leaders of Tejanos within the United States. In 1855, in the Galveston weekly newspaper, we find the first written record of a lynching of Mexicans. 11 Tejanos, the murder described and justified, mockingly, with the words,
"The whole race of Mexicans here is becoming a useless commodity, becoming cheap, dog cheap. 11 Mexicans, it is stated, have been found along the nooses in a hanged condition. Better so than to be left on the ground for the howling lobos to tear to pieces, and then howl the more for the red that burns his inside raw."
Lynchings of Tejanos continued up to the early 1900s. The land they had owned was grabbed not by small American settlers as in the West, but by large southern plantation owners from Virginia to South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. In southern Texas, 1.3 million acres of land were acquired by only 13 southern planters. The land had previously been owned by 360 Tejanos, mostly small farmers and ranchers. These were driven off their lands and coerced into signing over their property under the threat of violence. The Stillman, King, and Kennedy ranches were such properties which were acquired through coercion, fraud, and threats of violence by Americans. If you were a wealthy Tejano rancher, you were also driven off your land unless you had a daughter and could find an American settler willing to marry her. The McAllen and Young ranches in southern Texas were acquired by American settlers that way. This disrupted but also weirdly reinforced the Nortenos social structure with a patron at the center. In a way, the fundamental social structure remained the same. Mexican Tejas had been a place of loose federal government control in which communities gathered and organized around the wealthiest member of the community, the patron. And American Texas also became a place of loose federal government control in which communities gathered and organized around the wealthiest members of the community, be they cattle barons, oil barons, or today's tech barons. In 1941, a certain Lyndon B. Johnson ran for the Senate in Texas and won 90% of the votes in the southern counties of Texas. He had won those votes not by campaigning but by calling George Parr, also known as the Duke of Duval County, and making him promises that in return got him the votes. The same counties had given 95% of the vote to Johnson's rival in the governor's race the year before. In 1948, when Johnson ran for the Senate seat again, he again called George Parr and received 99% of the votes in that county. These notorious elections are the result of a development within Texas and Tejano political culture after American annexations in northern Mexico that continued previous hierarchical structures. Tejanos lived in the United States, but they were exempt from political powers and economic institutions. They rebelled at first, such as in 1859 when Juan Cortina led a rebellion against Texan authorities, but the rebellion was crushed. Tejanos who demanded equality were declared bandits by the state government, hunted down, killed, or even lynched. Tejanos therefore retreated into their own communities with their families and churches to be by themselves, for themselves, under their own norms and traditions, usually again under a patron. Right up to the 1970s, if you ran for political office in Texas, like Lyndon Johnson, and wanted what became in the American colloquial known as the Hispanic vote, you didn't campaign for it, but had a phone call with the patron. However, this segregation, dispossession, and consequent isolation that extended beyond Texas to Mexican-American communities up to California also had a different effect. Mexican Americans organized around their communities. They took care of each other, helped each other, built socio-economic institutions of their own, took care of each other through family and church, and as a community separated and disenfranchised, learned to rely upon others within their own community to organize together. There is a good reason for when desegregation finally came, why Mexican American communities were able to organize efficiently, run labor unions, organize political action communities, and gain and achieve political representation faster than many other historically disenfranchised minority communities within the United States. Despite all hardships that they endured, there was a perseverance and strength that they found within community structures. It wasn't until the opening of American society, desegregation, and the integration of the political process that the Nortenos re-emerged back into the general public, as well as the cultural and political stage. And it wasn't until recent years that Texan historians began to seriously and honestly examine their true history. Juan Seguin, the hero of the Battle of San Jacinto, may not have his name in the Wikipedia article of that battle yet, but public buildings across Texas are increasingly named after him. And the State Library and Archive was named after Lorenzo de Zavala. The stories of the Texan Nortenos, or Tejanos, raise interesting questions about the state and history of Texas in particular. They rebelled to be free from the tyranny and despotism of a Mexican dictatorship, and were then betrayed by those who wanted to keep slaves. So are Tejanos maybe even more Texan than those who rebelled to keep slaves? They have been around longer than the American settlers by 4 centuries, some of them being the descendants of settlers who came 100 years before the first English settled in Virginia. The only ones who predate them are the Apaches. The history of the Tejanos, Californios, and the Nortenos of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada also are in general one of the most interesting chapters in the history of what we call Manifest Destiny. The story of Manifest Destiny frequently is told in context of Americans taking land from native Indians, which is true, but often overlooks the important chapter of the land stolen from Mexicans after a betrayal. We should not forget that the Nortenos rebelled against Mexico, from Coahuila to Texas to Sonora to Baja California, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. That many of them wished to overthrow Santa Anna or even to secede from Mexico itself and form something new. When Mexicans are reminded of the Alamo by some rather uneducated Americans, it is worth pointing out that Mexicans were amongst the rebels at the Alamo. That the cultural narrative often found in popular history of Americans and Mexicans destined to be enemies is actually untrue, and that they may have more in common than you may think at first. To tell that story, one will have to immerse oneself into the Mexican and Norteno perspective of the history of these states and ask those questions and answers that we might examine closer in a future video. What matters for us here is that the Nortenos formed a cultural parcel of the United States, not completely Mexican, as they were separated from that and molded over centuries into the American socio-political cultural framework, but not fully part of the Anglo-majority cultural set in America, as they shared a culture with Nortenos across the border. But they also differ from last century's Mexican migrants in culture a lot, especially from those that came from southern Mexico. They show us one thing predominantly, that when you boil it down to basics, there is rarely such a thing as a cultural border. Borders are drawn by states, by governments, by government institutions, and not by cultures. And when this border was drawn, it fell into a time of extreme political friction. Post-Texan independence, Mexico was even a greater shambles. Inspired by the Texas example, more rebellions arose all across the Norteno lands in declarations of independence. The Republic of Rio Grande, the Republic of Baja California, the Republic of Sonora, and even down south in the Republic of Yucatan. After Santa Anna refused to make peace with Texas that had by now bankrupted itself, and with New England and the Midwest settlers inciting rebellion in California, the United States seized the opportunity and after winning a decisive victory, annexed large parts of northern Mexico, moving the border to where it now divides Nogales and follows the flow of the Rio Grande. However, the United States stopped short from annexing Sonora, Coahuila, and Baja California, even though they could have, and even though American mercenaries were involved in the rebellions there, because fundamentally this annexation was the result of a compromise. This chapter in the history book is one of those what-if chapters. The Americans could have drawn the border further south. They could have annexed all the rebelling republics, and the modern United States would have extended all the way down the Sierra Madre Mountains. Maps from that era show how this was in fact even considered. Instead, they didn't, and the remaining rebellions were crushed. The reason for this lies within the preeminent internal political conflict of the United States at the time, the conflict between the slave states south and the free states of New England. Opposition to the Mexican-American War and its annexations came from New England.
Who believes that a score of victories over Mexico, the annexation of half her provinces, will give us more liberty, a purer morality, a more prosperous industry than we have now? Murder cannot be hidden from God by a few flimsy rags called banners. Awake and arrest the work of butchery, where it shall be too late to preserve your souls from the guilt of wholesale slaughter.
Asked the prominent Massachusetts abolitionist and newspaper owner Horace Greeley, and the Massachusetts State Senate voted to condemn the Mexican-American War as
a war against freedom, against humanity, against justice, with the triple objective of extending slavery or obtaining the control of the free states.
And that was in the end true. The president at the time, James Polk, was a Southerner whose political loyalties lied with the Southern states that had long called for this war. Mississippi Senator John Quitman had called for an invasion of Mexico when Mexico abolished slavery to
prevent the establishing of a Negro and mongrel empire.
Southern legislators and representatives had long yearned to expand slavery in what they called the Golden Circle, which by 1854 became an organization called the Knights of the Golden Circle, a precursor to a certain other organization beginning with the letter K. They advocated for an annexation of the entire Mexican Gulf Coast, right down to Yucatan, enslaving its non-white inhabitants, and to then go to war with Spain to annex Cuba and Hispaniola, all of which should become new slave states, filled with slave plantations, to expand and create a slave empire along the Gulf of Mexico. A golden circle of slave states stretching all around the Gulf of Mexico. Hence the name. In 1854, when Spain abolished slavery, the Louisiana State Senate passed a motion that
condemning the abolition of slavery in Spanish Cuba and the sacrificing of the white race.
The southern states made no secret of the fact that they wished to expand so they could expand slavery. New England feared this and was terrified by the idea. It would double the slave states in the United States, and consequently the amount of slave state representatives in Senate, Congress, and electoral votes. Slave state legislators would have dominated the United States government. Consequently, the free states had a staunch opposition to any and all annexation of any Mexican lands. However, this was a little bit hypocritical. New England also expanded west and eventually into Mexican lands to gain more free states and hence political power over the slave states. At the same time, California was increasingly settled by people from the Midwest in the east and from New England along the coast. Although those two groups had not much in common, they both deplored and despised slavery, and California would also provide access to the Pacific, which the slave states could also benefit from. There are two things, however, that made Californian settlement different from Texas settlements. Despite what some Californians may tell you, there really wasn't much of a Californian independence movement or revolution. California's separation from Mexico was almost completely driven by the United States federal government, who immediately annexed it when the opportunity came. The other fact is that the New Englanders and Midwesterners who migrated there didn't manage to fully transplant their socio-political framework upon California as Southern planters did in Texas. Within years of annexation, gold rushes attracted hundreds of thousands of migrants from Chile to Argentina to Germany, Sweden and Ireland, Japan, Korea and China, Turkey, Jamaica and India. The population of California became incredibly diverse, where no one cultural group could dominate over all others, and the way society was run had to accommodate for all. The influx of immigrants also generated capital that fueled industrial development in sectors such as railroads, steel, manufacturing, farming, shipping, and more. In New England political culture, the well-being of the community had priority over the well-being of the individual, as it had developed out of Puritan English culture. But in California, the influx of migrants and the growth of industry through migrant groups, as well as the import of more cultures, resulted in individual freedoms taking a more prominent position on the stage as common values. Community values in California tended to be centered around groups of communities and churches, be they Mexican-American farmer communities, Japanese farmers, Argentinian miners, Irish and American harbor workers, or Chinese railroad workers. California politically aligned itself with New England, but socio-politically developed very differently. Racial segregation, as implemented in Texas, was attempted but less rigorously enforced and eventually collapsed. Mexican culture and Catholicism persevered to mix and mold with English culture and the various new arrivals into something unique and new, while the Nortenos of Texas remained mostly as they were. The Tejanos were segregated and consequently preserved much of their communal structures. In contrast to that, the Californios participated within the socio-political framework of the American society that formed. They helped reshape it throughout the coming century, but also themselves became a lot more American. California in the end became a mixed patchwork of cultures mixed together in a pioneer society. With no dominant cultural group, it needed to build a political structure that appealed to all. It became the place you went to start a new life, not just if you were American, but from anywhere in the world. A place more tolerant than most other parts of the country, which would therefore in its own regard significantly shape the United States. And while the Free States worked on bringing California into the Union, strategically the Free States also came to agree to an annexation of Texas as a slave state as part of a compromise. Texas to them seemed worthless, a scrap of desert with some parts where weird black liquid that stank of sulfur pierced through the sand. So nothing too valuable, but as a desert, perfect as a protective buffer zone to protect Louisiana and its New Orleans port, which, as the mouth of the Mississippi River, was the Achilles heel of the 19th century American economy. With annexation, an invader would have to take the long, difficult march through a hostile desert filled with Apaches and angry Southerners to get there. And unlike Mexico, the United States had another advantage that contributed to these annexations happening. For centuries, Spaniards and Mexicans had struggled with the difficult geography of the Chaparral. Attempts to enforce their state structures upon the region had failed miserably. The Spanish state had not the means to do so, and the Mexican state, which had inherited much of its political and economic structures from Spain, was too weak to do so either. But for the Americans and their state structure that had developed from the 1600s onward, which allowed for a more decentralized government structure, it was more possible. The geography of the Chaparral was and still is to this very day difficult for any society and state to control, but the institutions of the state that had developed in the United States made it easier for her to do so than for Mexico. This, together with the expansions driven by manifest destiny and the drive by free states and slave states to expand their political power, in the end would form the basis for a political compromise between those two rival factions within the US government. California would be annexed as a future free state, and to get access to the Pacific, and Texas as a future slave state that protected Louisiana as a strategic buffer. The border that today separates Mexico from the United States was not drawn by culture, language, geography, religion, ethnicity, or even just as conquest spoils of war. It was drawn as a compromise between two rival political camps in an attempt to prevent a civil war. A civil war that in the end happened anyway.